Rain hammered against the scorched bark of the oldest living thing in the Sierra Nevadas. But inside, Sadie was perfectly dry. 17 years old, legally a minor, and practically erased from society. She sat cross-legged on a floorboard she had scavenged from a local dump 6 months earlier. Her own mother had locked the front door, while she stood sobbing on the porch. Society had discarded her. The town of Oakhaven thought she was a runaway, a lost cause. They had no idea she was living hidden in the forest, fortified inside a hollow sequoia, a sanctuary that was about to outlive them all. The living room smelled of cheap whiskey, stale cigarette smoke, and the damp, oppressive weight of a coming winter. It was November 12th. And the town of Oakhaven, California, was already bracing for a bitter freeze. But the real storm was happening inside the walls of the Gallagher house. Sadie stood in the center of the faded floral rug, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her oversized denim jacket, trying to keep them from trembling. Across from her stood Richard, her stepfather. He was a mountain of a man, an ex-foreman at the local lumber mill with a temper as volatile as a dry brush fire. His face was flushed crimson, and the veins in his thick neck stood out like cords. $500. Sadie, Richard snarled, his voice a dangerous, low rumble. From the lockbox in my garage. You think I wouldn't notice? I didn't touch your money, Sadie said, her voice tighter, higher than she wanted it to be. I haven't even been in the garage since Tuesday. Liar! He slammed his heavy fist onto the coffee table, rattling a half-empty bottle of bourbon and sending a ceramic ashtray crashing to the floor. Who else knew the combination? Who else is always sneaking around this house like a rat? Sadie looked past Richard, desperately searching the shadows of the kitchen. Her mother, Caroline, stood leaning against the counter, obsessively wiping down a clean surface with a sponge. Caroline's eyes were locked on the linoleum. She wasn't going to help. She never did. Since Sadie's biological father had died 5 years ago, Caroline had slowly folded into herself, becoming a ghost in her own home, entirely subjugated by Richard's tyrannical moods. The sick twist of it all was that Sadie knew exactly where the money went. 2 nights ago, she had overheard Richard on the phone, aggressively negotiating with a bookie in Reno. He had gambled the mortgage money on college football, lost spectacularly, and emptied his own lockbox to cover a fraction of his debts. Now, he needed a scapegoat. He needed to make sure Caroline believed the financial ruin was Sadie's fault, not his. Mom, Sadie pleaded, taking a step toward the kitchen. Mom, look at me. You know I wouldn't do this. I've been saving my own money from the diner. I don't need his. Caroline stopped wiping the counter. For an agonizing second, she looked up, her eyes meeting her daughter's. There was an ocean of guilt in that gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the truth. But then the fear took over. She looked back down at the sponge. Just give him the money back, Sadie, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the refrigerator. The betrayal hit Sadie like a physical blow to the stomach. The air rushed out of her lungs. It was one thing to be bullied by a man who hated her. It was entirely another to be sacrificed by the woman who was supposed to protect her. I don't have it, Sadie said, her tone suddenly devoid of panic, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. And you know I don't. Richard pointed a thick, calloused finger at the front door. Then get out. I'm done feeding a thief. I'm done putting a roof over a delinquent. You have 15 minutes to pack whatever fits in a bag, and then you are out of my house. Richard! She's 17, Caroline finally squeaked. A pathetic, half-hearted defense. It's freezing outside. She should have thought about that before she stole from me, he roared, stepping toward Caroline, which instantly shut her up. He turned his dead, bloodshot eyes back to Sadie. 15 minutes, or I throw you out with nothing but the clothes on your back. Sadie didn't argue. The realization had settled over her like a heavy blanket. This wasn't a fight she could win. She ran down the narrow hallway to her tiny bedroom. Her heart pounded frantically against her ribs as she pulled a canvas rucksack from her closet. Panic threatened to paralyze her, but survival instincts kicked in. What did she need? Warmth. She grabbed 2 pairs of heavy Levi's, 3 thick flannel shirts, her winter parka, and a collection of wool socks. She grabbed a small flashlight, a box of wooden matches, and a heavy hunting knife with a bone handle, the last thing her biological father had given her before the cancer took him. She checked her secret stash hidden inside an old cassette case, $42 and some loose change. That was her entire net worth. Finally, she strapped her Sub-Zero sleeping bag to the bottom of the rucksack. When she walked back into the living room, the silence was deafening. Richard was drinking straight from the bottle. Caroline was gone, likely locked in the master bathroom, crying. Without a word, Sadie walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch. As she crossed the threshold, the heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, followed by the definitive, metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding into place. The icy November rain immediately began to soak into her shoulders. Sadie stood on the porch for a long moment, staring at the darkened street of Elm Avenue. The streetlights flickered, casting long, lonely shadows on the wet asphalt. She was 17. She was legally a child. She had $42, nowhere to go, and the creeping realization that the town of Oakhaven, with its gossiping neighbors and corrupt local police who played poker with Richard on weekends, would offer her no shelter. She hitched the heavy rucksack higher on her back, pulled her hood up, and stepped off the porch into the freezing downpour, disappearing into the blackness of the night. Sadie walked for 3 hours. She avoided the main drag of Highway 9, terrified that Sheriff Davies would spot her walking alone past curfew and drag her right back to Richard's house, or worse, lock her in a juvenile holding cell for running away. Her boots were soaked through, her toes numb. The rain was unrelenting, a freezing cascade that felt like needles against her cheeks. She found herself drifting toward the eastern edge of town, where the suburban streets dissolved into the wild, untamed foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. This was logging country. But beyond the commercial timber zones lay the protected reserves, an ancient, towering landscape of old-growth pines, cedars, and massive giant sequoias. As a little girl, Sadie used to hike these woods with her father. He was a local botanist and a fierce defender of the old-growth trees. He had taught her how to navigate by the moss on the trunks, how to identify edible forage, and the hidden topography of the deep woods. Desperation drove her past the rusted chain-link fence that marked the boundary of the state reserve. The forest canopy above was so thick that the rain was reduced to a heavy, dripping mist. It was pitch black, illuminated only by the weak, erratic beam of her flashlight. The mud sucked at her boots, threatening to steal them with every step. She was shivering violently now. Hypothermia was a very real, very imminent threat. She needed shelter, and she needed it immediately. She pushed deeper, navigating a treacherous descent into a deep ravine known as Black Bear Hollow. It was notoriously difficult terrain, avoided by day hikers and ignored by loggers. At the bottom of the ravine, the forest floor opened up into a small, secluded grove. That was when her flashlight beam hit the wall of bark. It was massive, an impossible column of cinnamon-colored wood that disappeared into the darkness above. It was a giant sequoia. But not just any sequoia. It was a colossal ancient, easily 30 feet in diameter at its base. Sadie walked toward it, her flashlight tracing the deep, vertical grooves of its spongy bark. As she rounded the trunk, the light caught a massive, cavernous opening. Centuries ago, perhaps long before the town of Oakhaven ever existed, a brutal forest fire had swept through this ravine. Giant sequoias are incredibly fire-resistant, their thick bark acting like armor. But the fire had found a weak spot, burning an arching doorway into the base of the tree and entirely hollowing out the heartwood inside. Despite the missing core, the outer rings and cambium layer had survived. The tree was still alive, its canopy hundreds of feet above, but its base was a hollow, wooden cave. Sadie stepped cautiously through the burnt archway. The interior was breathtakingly large, a circular room almost 20 feet across. But the most important detail was the smell. Dry dust and old ash. The thick, insulating walls of the living tree had completely blocked out the rain and the bitter wind. It was incredibly dry inside, and noticeably warmer than the freezing ravine. She shone her light upward. The hollow extended up like a chimney, tapering off about 40 feet above her head, where the tree had healed solid again. Sadie collapsed onto the dry, earthy floor. Her muscles screamed in agony, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She fumbled with her rucksack, her numb fingers struggling with the buckles. She managed to pull out the sleeping bag, stripped off her soaking wet jacket and boots, and crawled inside, zipping it up over her head. She lay there in the pitch black, inside the belly of the giant. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the upper branches of the forest. But down here, inside the tree, there was only a profound, ancient silence. I am homeless, she thought, the reality crashing over her in waves of terror. I have nothing. I am going to die out here. She cried until her chest physically hurt, mourning the life she had known, mourning the mother who had abandoned her. But as the hours passed, the thick, protective embrace of the sequoia seemed to absorb her panic. The tree had stood here through lightning strikes, blizzards, wildfires, and centuries of human history. It was a testament to endurance. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion finally pulled her into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, weak slivers of gray morning light were filtering through the arched doorway. She was hungry, she was thirsty, and she was entirely alone. But she was alive. And as she looked around the massive, dry interior of the hollowed trunk, a crazy, desperate idea began to take root in her mind. She didn't just need a place to hide for the night. She needed a home, and she was sitting inside it. The transition from a terrified runaway to an architect of survival didn't happen overnight. It was forged in brutal, exhausting increments over the next 2 months. The first order of business was sealing the entrance. The natural archway was wide enough to let a bear wander in, let alone the biting winter wind. 3 miles away, on the edge of the Oakhaven lumber yard, was a graveyard of discarded materials, warped wood, dented corrugated tin roofing, and torn industrial tarps. Every night, under the cover of darkness, Sadie made the grueling 3-mile trek. She became a shadow, slipping past the sleeping town. She stole a rusted hammer and a canvas bag of assorted nails from an unlocked maintenance shed behind the local high school. She dragged heavy sheets of discarded plywood through the brush, her hands blistered and bleeding, her muscles burning under the strain. Constructing the cabin inside the tree required extreme care. She couldn't drive nails deep into the living cambium layer of the sequoia, or she risked injuring the tree that was protecting her. Instead, she used the massive, jagged contours of the burnt heartwood as a natural frame. She wedged heavy 2x4s into the deep grooves, locking them into place using tension and cross-bracing. She built a raised floor first, suspending it a foot above the dirt to protect against moisture and the occasional insect intrusion. Then, she framed a sturdy wall to block off the archway. To the outside world, she camouflaged the exterior of the wall with thick slabs of dead bark and moss she collected from fallen logs. If a hiker were to accidentally wander into the deep ravine, which they never did, they would only see the scarred base of a massive tree, completely oblivious to the hidden door carved into the bark. Inside, she insulated the walls with layers of heavy plastic tarps and thick packing blankets she found in a dumpster behind Miller's furniture store. Food was a constant, gnawing challenge. $42 vanished quickly on cheap calories, bags of rice, beans, and peanut butter. When the money ran out, she had to get creative. She learned the schedule of the local grocery store, diving into the dumpsters right after they tossed the expired but safe produce and dented cans. Her most daring supply run, however, was a twist of pure poetic justice. One Tuesday night, knowing Richard played poker until 2 a.m. at the Elks Lodge, Sadie crept back to her old neighborhood. She slipped through the side gate, used her hidden spare key to open the detached garage, and raided Richard's massive emergency chest freezer. She took frozen venison, bags of frozen vegetables, and 3 boxes of ammunition for the rifle she knew he kept out there. She didn't take the gun that was a felony that would bring the police down on her, but stealing the food felt like claiming unpaid child support. By January, the inside of the tree had transformed from a dirt hollow into a marvel of desperate engineering. She had built a sturdy wooden ladder, leading up to a second floor, A sleeping loft, suspended 15 feet in the air, nestled in a narrow, dry pocket of the hollow. Since heat rises, the loft was incredibly warm. For fire, she built a small, heavily insulated hearth on the bottom floor, using river stones and thick mud clay. The most genius part of her design was the ventilation. Instead of running a pipe out the front, which would reveal smoke to anyone looking, she utilized a natural vertical crack inside the hollow trunk. She routed a scavenged aluminum dryer duct up through the crack, allowing the smoke to dissipate slowly into the dense, foggy canopy of the Sequoia, completely masking its origin. But the physical survival was only half the battle. The mental toll of absolute isolation threatened to crack her mind. For weeks, her only companion was her journal, illuminated by the soft glow of scavenged, half-burnt candles. She wrote pages of fury directed at her mother, letters she would never send. She wrote about the profound silence of the woods, a silence so deep it often caused her ears to ring. She had close calls. In late February, she was reading a stolen paperback in her loft when she heard voices. Her heart stopped. She peered through a tiny knothole she used as a peephole. Less than 50 yards away, Ranger Harrison, an older, sharp-eyed park ranger, was leading a local botanist through the brush, examining winter flora. Sadie stopped breathing. She didn't move a muscle. She watched as Harrison stopped, looking directly at the camouflaged bark wall of her tree. He squinted, tilting his head. Sadie's hand drifted slowly to her hunting knife. If he found her, he would call social services. She would be forced back into the system, back to Richard, or thrown into a group home. "Look at the size of this old giant," Harrison muttered, walking closer. He reached out and patted the bark just inches from the edge of Sadie's hidden door. "Survived the fire of 1,889. Still standing strong." "Magnificent," the botanist agreed, making a note on his clipboard. "All right, let's head back up the ridge." Sadie didn't exhale until they had been gone for 20 minutes. She was safe, but the encounter was a brutal reminder of how fragile her hidden life was. She was a ghost, living on borrowed time. But something much bigger than Ranger Harrison was coming for Oakhaven. As March approached, the barometric pressure in the valley plummeted to historic lows. The deer vanished from the woods, seeking deep shelter. The air grew unseasonably still, heavy with a thick, ominous energy. The local news stations down in the valley were frantically broadcasting warnings. But Sadie, without a radio, only had the ancient instincts of the forest to warn her. A monstrous atmospheric river, fueled by unusually warm Pacific currents and colliding with Arctic air, was barreling directly toward the Sierra foothills. It wasn't just a storm, it was a localized hurricane, a weather event that happened once every 200 years, and Oakhaven was sitting directly in its crosshairs. The change in the atmosphere didn't begin with rain. It began with a profound, terrifying silence. By the afternoon of March 14th, the usual chatter of Steller's jays and the rustling of squirrels in the brush had completely ceased. The air grew thick, carrying a strange metallic taste, and the sky above the dense canopy turned a bruised, sickening shade of purple-black. Sadie was splitting scavenged firewood outside her hidden entrance when the first gust hit. It wasn't a breeze. It was a physical blow that nearly knocked her off her feet, carrying with it a shower of pine needles and dead twigs. She scrambled inside, dragging her meager pile of wood behind her, and sealed the heavy plywood door. She slid the 3 deadbolts she had scavenged and installed into place. Just as the final bolt clicked, the heavens tore open. It sounded as though a freight train was barreling directly over the roof of the forest. The rain didn't fall. It was driven sideways by winds that National Weather Service sensors down in the valley were clocking at 95 miles per hour. This was the Pineapple Express, a relentless atmospheric river pulling billions of gallons of moisture straight from the tropics and slamming it into the freezing elevations of the Sierra Nevadas. Inside the hollow Sequoia, Sadie lit her solitary kerosene lantern. Her hands were shaking. She had survived freezing temperatures and near starvation, but the sheer, violent acoustic power of the storm was paralyzing. She retreated up the wooden ladder to her sleeping loft, wrapping herself entirely in her sub-zero sleeping bag. Above her, the massive trunk of the giant Sequoia acted like a wooden megaphone, amplifying the howling wind outside. But the most terrifying sensation wasn't the noise. It was the movement. Giant sequoias have incredibly shallow root systems for their size, spreading out wide rather than digging deep. As the hurricane-force winds battered the top of the tree 200 feet above, Sadie could actually feel the massive trunk swaying. It was a slow, groaning pendulum motion. Every time the wind peaked, the wood around her emitted a deep, resonant creak that vibrated right through her ribcage. If it snaps, she thought, squeezing her eyes shut. If it uproots, I'll be crushed instantly. They'll never even find my body. But the ancient giant held. It had stood exactly in this spot for perhaps 3,000 years. It had survived the Great Flood of 1,862. Its massive, flared base, gripping the earth like a fist, absorbed the kinetic fury of the wind. While Sadie huddled in terror, safe and bone-dry inside her wooden fortress, the town of Oakhaven was experiencing a completely different reality. Built in a natural bowl-shaped valley where Miller's Creek intersected with the larger Granite River, Oakhaven was a geographical trap. For decades, Mayor Higgins had ignored warnings from civil engineers about the aging levees, opting instead to allocate town funds to a new sports complex and downtown beautification. Now, the town was paying the price for his hubris. By 9 p.m., the storm drains backed up. By midnight, Miller's Creek breached its banks, sending a foot of muddy, freezing water surging down Main Street. Down on Elm Avenue, inside the house Sadie had been exiled from, panic had finally set in. Richard, entirely sober for the first time in weeks, was frantically stuffing valuables into a plastic garbage bag. The water was already seeping under the front door, soaking the faded floral rug where Sadie had stood 4 months ago. "Richard, the car won't start," Caroline screamed, her voice bordering on hysteria as she waded into the living room. "The water is halfway up the tires. Grab the flashlights and get on the kitchen counters," Richard bellowed, his usual dominant bluster replaced by raw, unadulterated fear. "The levee on the east side is going to give. I can hear it." The irony of the situation was entirely lost on them. The very house they had deemed too crowded, too expensive to share with a teenage girl, was rapidly becoming a flooded tomb, while the girl they had thrown to the wolves was sheltered in the strongest structure for 100 miles. Back in the ravine, a deafening crack echoed over the roar of the wind, followed by a ground-shaking thud that rattled Sadie's teeth. A massive ponderosa pine, its roots completely liquefied by the torrential rain, had fallen less than 50 feet from her door. The impact sent a shockwave through the mud, but the sequoia didn't even flinch. Sadie stayed awake for 48 hours straight. She fed her small clay hearth with just enough wood to keep the ambient temperature bearable, praying that the smoke would continue to mask itself in the raging tempest above. She rationed her water, listening to the end of the world outside her door. It wasn't until the morning of the third day that the howling finally subsided, replaced by the steady, dripping rhythm of residual rain falling from the canopy. Sadie waited another 6 hours before she finally gathered the courage to slide the deadbolts back. She pushed her shoulder against the heavy plywood door. It didn't budge. Panic spiked in her chest. Had the fallen pine blocked her in? She shoved harder, bracing her boots against the dirt floor, putting her entire body weight into it. With a sickening scrape, the door forced a pile of debris out of the way and swung outward. Sadie stepped out into the ravine and gasped. The landscape was unrecognizable. It looked as though a giant had taken a scythe to the forest. Massive trees lay crisscrossed like dropped matchsticks. The floor of the ravine, usually covered in dry needles and ferns, was a churning river of thick brown mud and debris. But her tree, her magnificent, hollowed-out guardian, stood perfectly intact, shedding water from its spongy red bark like a duck's back. She pulled on her boots and her heavy parka. She needed to know what had happened. She needed to see if the world beyond the woods still existed. Navigating the devastation was treacherous. It took her 3 hours to hike 1.5 miles up to the crest of Harper's Ridge, a rocky outcropping that offered a clear view of the valley below. She slipped in the mud countless times, her hands raw from grabbing onto jagged branches to keep from sliding down the steep embankments. When she finally breached the tree line and stepped onto the rocky ledge, The breath left her lungs. "Oh my God," she whispered into the cold morning air. Oak Haven was gone. Or at least, the Oak Haven she knew was gone. The entire valley floor was a murky, swirling lake of brown water. The granite river had completely bypassed its channel, cutting a destructive new path straight through the commercial district. The roof of the local grocery store, the same one she had dumpster dived behind, was barely visible above the waterline. She could see cars overturned, wedged against the sides of commercial buildings. Entire swaths of suburban homes, particularly those in the lower elevation of Elm Avenue, were submerged up to their eaves. Sirens wailed incessantly in the distance, a haunting chorus echoing off the surrounding mountains. Flashing red and blue lights clustered on the elevated highway overpass, where it appeared a makeshift triage and evacuation center had been set up. A strange, complex cocktail of emotions swirled in Sadie's chest. There was horror, certainly, at the scale of the devastation. There was a deep, instinctual sympathy for the people down there whose lives had just been destroyed. But beneath that, buried under the shock, was a dark, undeniable ember of vindication. They threw me away, she thought, her grip tightening on the wet bark of a nearby sapling. They told me I wouldn't survive a week. Richard told me I was nothing. She looked back over her shoulder into the dense, foggy depths of the old-growth forest. Out there, hidden among the wreckage of lesser trees, was her home. It was warm. It was dry. It was stocked with scavenged food and heated by a fire she had built with her own 2 hands. At 17, entirely abandoned by the social safety net, she had outsmarted a catastrophic disaster that had brought the entire town to its knees. As she stood on the ridge, watching Coast Guard helicopters begin to circle the flooded valley, a new realization dawned on her. The dynamics of power had violently shifted. She was no longer the helpless runaway hiding from Sheriff Davies and the cruelty of her stepfather. She was a survivor. And down in that valley, freezing, homeless, and desperate, were the very people who had cast her out. The storm had washed away the town, but it had also washed away the laws, the social hierarchies, and the protections that Richard and his cronies relied upon. Oak Haven was a disaster zone now. Sadie turned away from the flooded valley and began the difficult descent back into the woods. She had to secure her camp, with hundreds of displaced, desperate people soon to be wandering the high ground. Her hidden sanctuary was about to become the most valuable real estate in the county, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would have to defend it. For 3 days, the valley of Oak Haven remained an impassable toxic lake. From her vantage point on Harper's Ridge, Sadie watched the slow, agonizing reality of the disaster unfold. The Coast Guard helicopters eventually stopped plucking people from rooftops, replaced by National Guard flatboats navigating the muddy currents of Main Street. But the rescue efforts were painfully inadequate. The highway overpass, the only strip of concrete above the waterline, had become a squalid, freezing refugee camp. Through a pair of cracked binoculars she had scavenged weeks ago, Sadie could see the shivering masses huddled under blue plastic tarps. There was no power, no clean water, and the temperatures plummeted below freezing every night. By the 4th day, the desperate tide began to turn toward the mountains. People who had lost everything realized that waiting on the overpass meant risking exposure and disease. Small, ragged groups began to brave the treacherous hike up into the Sierra foothills, seeking the shelter of the old logging cabins and ranger stations scattered miles deep in the woods. Sadie knew they wouldn't find much. Most of those structures had been crushed by the hurricane-force winds or swallowed by mudslides. The forest was no longer a state park. It was a hostile, jagged labyrinth. On a freezing Tuesday morning, the war came to her doorstep. Sadie was inside her hollow Sequoia, meticulously sharpening the blade of her bone-handled hunting knife by the light of the hearth, when she heard it. It wasn't the groan of settling timber or the scurry of a raccoon. It was a human voice. A child, crying in sharp, terrified gasps. She extinguished her lantern, crept to the heavy plywood door, and pressed her eye against the knothole. 50 yards away, struggling through the deep, churning mud of the ravine, was a woman dragging a young boy by the hand. Sadie's breath hitched. She recognized them. It was Martha Gable, the head teller at the Oakhaven local bank, and her 8-year-old son, Leo. Martha lived 3 houses down from Richard. She was the woman who used to politely wave at Sadie from her driveway, deliberately ignoring the shouting and the sound of breaking glass echoing from the Gallagher house. Martha looked half dead. Her expensive winter coat was caked in thick brown slime, her face pale and drawn tight with exhaustion. Leo was missing a shoe, his small foot wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. They were completely off the trail, blindly stumbling into the deepest, most dangerous part of Black Bear Hollow. "Keep moving, Leo," Martha pleaded, her voice cracking. "We have to find somewhere dry." Just a little further, they were heading straight for the washout, a 50-foot drop-off, where the storm had completely sheared away the side of the ravine. In her disoriented state, Martha couldn't see the edge hidden beneath a tangle of fallen pine branches. Sadie watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. The old Sadie, the discarded, invisible teenager, would have stayed hidden behind the bark wall. She owed Oakhaven nothing. She owed Martha Gable nothing. But, as Leo stumbled, slipping to his knees in the freezing mud mere feet from the concealed drop-off, the hardened shell Sadie had built around herself cracked. She slid the deadbolts back with a sharp clack, shoved the heavy door open, and stepped out into the biting cold. "Stop right there!" Sadie shouted, her voice ringing out through the quiet ravine with a startling, commanding authority. Martha screamed, instinctively pulling Leo behind her, her wide, terrified eyes searching the wreckage. When she finally locked onto Sadie, standing on the elevated root system of the massive Sequoia, her jaw dropped. "Sadie? Sadie Gallagher?" Martha gasped, blinking as if staring at an apparition. They said you ran away to Los Angeles months ago. We thought you were dead." "Don't take another step forward," Sadie ordered, ignoring the woman's shock. She pointed a gloved finger at the brush ahead of them. "You're standing on a false edge. The mud under those branches is hollow. You take one more step, and you're both falling 50 feet into a rock bed." Martha looked down, suddenly realizing the ground beneath her boots was shifting precariously. Panic seized her, and she froze, clutching Leo so tightly the boy whimpered. Sadie sighed, sliding down the massive roots and navigating the mud with the practiced agility of someone who had lived in it for months. She grabbed a sturdy fallen branch, extended it across the muck, and anchored herself against a granite boulder. "Grab the branch," Sadie instructed, her tone devoid of emotion. "Walk slowly. Don't look down." Trembling violently, Martha gripped the wood. Inch by inch, Sadie guided the mother and son away from the precipice and onto the solid bedrock near the base of the Sequoia. Once they were safe, Martha collapsed onto her knees, sobbing uncontrollably into her muddy hands. "Thank you," Martha wept. "Oh God, thank you. Our house, the water came up so fast. We were on the roof for 2 days. The shelters on the highway are a nightmare. People are fighting over bottled water. We just kept walking." Leo was shivering so hard his teeth clicked together in a rapid staccato. His lips were tinged blue. Hypothermia was setting in fast. Sadie looked at the boy, then up at the massive, camouflaged wall of her tree. She was about to break the cardinal rule of survival. Never reveal your sanctuary. But letting an 8-year-old freeze to death wasn't a line she was willing to cross. "Turn around," Sadie said quietly. Martha looked up, confused. "What?" "Close your eyes, Martha. Don't open them until I tell you to." Too exhausted to argue, Martha covered Leo's eyes and closed her own. Sadie quickly moved to the bark-covered door, pulled it open, and stepped inside, leaving it wide enough for them to pass. "Okay. Come inside. Quickly." Martha opened her eyes and gasped. Where a solid wall of ancient tree bark had been seconds ago, a dark, rectangular doorway now stood open, emitting a wave of glorious, dry, wood smoke-scented heat. "Hurry up," Sadie snapped, checking the tree line for any other followers. Martha grabbed Leo and scrambled through the doorway. Sadie pulled the door shut behind them, slamming the 3 heavy deadbolts into place. She struck a match and lit the kerosene lantern. The soft yellow light illuminated the interior of the hollow giant. Martha and Leo stood frozen in absolute disbelief. They looked at the raised, dry floor, the neatly stacked firewood, the clay hearth radiating heat, and the suspended sleeping loft above. It wasn't a hiding spot. It was a fortress. "Take off his wet clothes," Sadie ordered, tossing Martha a thick wool blanket from her scavenged stash. "Sit him by the hearth. I have some heated broth left over from this morning." As Martha aggressively rubbed her son's arms to return the circulation, she looked around the cavernous wooden room, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and profound shame. "You built this?" Martha whispered, her voice echoing softly off the burnt heartwood. "A 17-year-old girl built this?" Richard told everyone you stole his money and hitched a ride with a trucker." Sadie poured hot deer bone broth into a tin cup and handed it to the boy. She looked down at Martha, her eyes cold and piercing in the lantern light. "Richard is a liar, Martha. And the whole town knew it. But it was easier to let him throw me into the street than to speak up, wasn't it?" Martha lowered her head, tears cutting clean tracks through the mud on her face. "I'm so sorry, Sadie. I am so sorry." "Eat the soup," Sadie said flatly, turning her back to tend the fire. "You can stay the night. But tomorrow, you're moving on." By nightfall, the wind picked up again, howling through the upper canopy. But inside the Sequoia, the air was thick with tension and warmth. Leo had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep on Sadie's spare sleeping mat. Martha sat quietly by the fire, staring into the embers, the reality of her shattered life settling heavily upon her shoulders. Sadie sat on the bottom rung of her ladder, cleaning her knife. She hadn't let her guard down for a second. Bringing them in was a calculated risk, but the woods were unpredictable, and human desperation was far more dangerous than any hungry black bear. "How long have you been out here?" Martha asked softly, breaking the hours-long silence. "Since the night he threw me out." "Mid-November," Sadie replied, not looking up from the whetstone. "You survived the winter. In a tree." Martha shook her head. "If people down there knew you had this." "Sadie, it's a war zone, below. The grocery store was looted clean before the water even crested. People are getting desperate, which is why no one can know about this place," Sadie said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She pointed the tip of the blade toward Martha. "If you breathe a word of this to anyone at the refugee camps, they will swarm this ravine. They will tear this tree apart looking for food and shelter. And I will not let that happen." "I swear it," Martha said quickly, raising her hands. "I swear on Leo's life, Sadie. You saved us." The solemn vow was interrupted by a sound that made Sadie's blood turn to ice. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, metallic clack-clack of a pump-action shotgun chambering a round. It echoed from outside, muffled slightly by the thick walls of the tree, but unmistakable. Sadie instantly snuffed out the kerosene lantern, plunging the hollow into total darkness, save for the faint red glow of the hearth embers. "Quiet," Sadie hissed, grabbing a bucket of sand and dumping it over the coals, suffocating the fire entirely. The sudden darkness caused Leo to stir and whimper, but Martha immediately clamped a hand over his mouth. Sadie crept to the door and pressed her ear against the thick plywood. Heavy boots were trudging through the mud outside, not the erratic, panicked footsteps of a lost mother and child, but the heavy, deliberate stomping of men searching for something. "I'm telling you, Bo, I smelled wood smoke," a gruff, heavily accented voice grumbled. Sadie closed her eyes. It was Frank Collins. He was a local mechanic, a notorious drunk, and one of Richard's closest poker buddies. "Smells like wet pine and dead fish to me, Frank," another voice replied. It was Billy Bo Jenkins, a violent man with a rap sheet for aggravated assault. "Ain't nobody out here. It's suicide terrain. Let's just head up to the old ranger station." "Ranger station is gone, idiot. Mudslide took it," Frank snapped. "Keep your light on the ground. Look for tracks." Sadie's stomach plummeted. Martha and Leo had left a massive, chaotic trail of disturbed mud leading directly to the base of the Sequoia. The rain hadn't been heavy enough today to wash it away. She backed away from the door and silently climbed the ladder to her loft. She grabbed the heavy canvas rucksack and pulled out the single box of ammunition she had stolen from Richard's garage months ago. She didn't have a gun, but she had a plan. She had spent months preparing for the possibility of a breach. "Frank. Hey, Frank, look at this." Beau's voice drifted through the knothole. Sadie peered down through a tiny crack in the upper bark. Outside, the harsh beam of a heavy-duty tactical flashlight was sweeping over the muddy ground, illuminating the deep, frantic boot prints Martha had left right at the tree's root system. The light slowly panned up, tracing the massive, cinnamon-colored trunk. It stopped squarely on the section of bark Sadie had meticulously glued over her plywood door. "Tracks just stop. Right at the base," Beau said, stepping closer. Through the crack, Sadie could see the two men clearly. They looked feral. Their clothes were soaked, their faces unshaven and desperate. Frank was holding a .1-2 gauge shotgun at the ready. "That ain't right," Frank muttered, stepping up to the root system. He reached out with his free hand and ran his thick fingers over the bark. Sadie held her breath. The camouflage was good from 10 feet away, but up close, to a man actively looking for anomalies, it was flawed. Frank's fingers found the straight, unnatural vertical seam where the door met the living tree. He pushed against it. The heavy deadbolts held firm, but the plywood gave a fraction of an inch, emitting a dull, hollow thud. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank whispered, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "It's a door. Somebody built a damn bunker in the tree." He took a step back and raised the shotgun, pointing it directly at the center of the wood. "Whoever's in there," Frank bellowed, his voice echoing off the ravine walls. "Unbolt the door and step out with your hands up, or I blow the lock off and take whatever you've got over your dead body." Inside, Martha was weeping silently, curled around Leo in the pitch black. Up in the loft, Sadie didn't panic. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a wooden match, and struck it against the sole of her boot. The small flame flared to life. She picked up a handful of the heavy, brass, 30-06 rifle cartridges she had stolen from Richard. She had spent weeks prying the lead bullets out of a dozen casings, pouring the highly combustible gunpowder into a small tin can, creating a crude but incredibly volatile flash bomb. "I'm giving you 3 seconds!" Frank yelled outside, taking aim. 1! Sadie held the tin can over the natural ventilation crack she used for her chimney. 2! She dropped the lit match into the tin. It immediately sparked. With a violent, underhanded throw, she tossed the smoking tin straight down the ventilation shaft. Thud! The tin canister shot out of the top of the hollow trunk and plummeted toward the ground outside. It detonated mid-air, right above Frank and Beau's heads. It wasn't a lethal explosion. But in the pitch-black, silent ravine, the concussive bang and the blinding white flash of ignited gunpowder were utterly terrifying. The sound bounced off the giant trees, multiplying into what sounded like a massive exchange of gunfire. "Sniper! Up on the ridge!" Beau screamed in blind panic, dropping his flashlight and diving face first into the mud. Frank, entirely disoriented by the flash, fired his shotgun blindly into the tree canopy, the recoil knocking him backward off the slippery roots. "They're shooting at us! Run!" Sadie watched through the crack as the two hardened men scrambled over the treacherous terrain, abandoning their flashlight and sprinting back toward the valley in sheer, unadulterated terror. Silence slowly returned to the hollow, save for the ragged breathing of Martha below. Sadie climbed back down the ladder, her legs trembling slightly from the adrenaline rush. She picked up the bucket of sand, cleared enough away to expose a single glowing ember, and relit the kerosene lantern. Martha stared at the teenager, her eyes wide with a newfound, terrifying respect. Sadie Gallagher wasn't a runaway anymore. She was the undisputed queen of the mountain, and she had just declared war on anyone who tried to take her throne. "Get some sleep, Martha," Sadie said, her voice ice cold. "Tomorrow, you're going to go back down to the overpass, and you're going to deliver a message for me." Dawn broke over the devastated valley with a cold, unforgiving gray light. Inside the Sequoia, the atmosphere was strictly business. Sadie handed Martha a crude map drawn on the back of a scavenged bean can label using a piece of charred wood. The main trails are gone, but the ridge line is stable, Sadie instructed, pointing to a jagged line on the paper. Keep the morning sun exactly at your 9 o'clock. It will lead you straight down to the highway overpass. Martha nodded, her hands trembling as she tucked the map into her damp coat. She looked at Sadie, her expression a mix of awe and profound exhaustion. And the message? Sadie's jaw tightened. You tell Mayor Higgins and Sheriff Davies that the water down there is contaminated with sewage and diesel fuel. You tell them that I control the only pure, uncontaminated natural spring left on this side of the mountain, right here in the hollow. I have a route that National Guard flatboats can use to extract people from the North Ridge, but I am not sharing any of it until my demands are met. Leo looked up, his small face pale but warm. What do you want, Sadie? I want Richard Gallagher to stand on the hood of a police cruiser in front of the entire camp, Sadie said, her voice hard as flint. And I want him to scream to the heavens that he stole his own mortgage money to pay off a Reno bookie, and that he framed me for it. I want my name cleared, and I want 3 heavy-duty military winter sleeping bags from the next FEMA airdrop. Martha swallowed hard. Richard will kill you, Sadie. He's down there raging. He's been telling anyone who will listen that you robbed him blind. Let him try, Sadie replied, patting the bone-handled knife at her hip. Tell them they have 24 hours to make the broadcast over the police bullhorn. If I hear it echoing up the valley, I'll send up a green smoke flare using pine needles and copper wire to guide the rescue choppers to the safe zone. If I don't hear it, Oakhaven can drink the mud. By noon, Martha and Leo had successfully navigated the treacherous descent, stumbling onto the crowded, freezing concrete of the Interstate 80 overpass. The scene was apocalyptic. Hundreds of shivering citizens were huddled under tarps. Fights were breaking out over half-empty bottles of water. Martha immediately demanded to see Sheriff Davies. She was escorted to a makeshift command tent, where Davies, Mayor Higgins, and Richard Gallagher were arguing over dwindling diesel rations for the town's only working generator. When Martha relayed the message, the tent fell dead silent. Richard's face drained of color, then rapidly flooded with a mottled, violent crimson. She's alive? He sputtered, spit flying from his lips. That lying little thief is hiding up in the woods hoarding fresh water while we freeze? She didn't steal your money, Richard, Martha said, her voice surprisingly steady, bolstered by the memory of the warm hearth inside the giant tree. And everyone in this town knows what you really are. You want the water? You make the confession. Sheriff Davies, a man whose moral compass had always pointed toward the highest bidder, sneered. He adjusted his heavy gun belt. We ain't negotiating with a runaway teenager, Martha. Where exactly is this spring? I'll never tell you, Martha defied, stepping back. Doesn't matter, Bo Jenkins interrupted, pushing his way into the tent. He was covered in mud and nursing a bruised cheek from his panicked flight the night before. Frank and I found her. She's dug in deep, at the bottom of Black Bear Hollow. Got some kind of fortified bunker built right into the trees. She threw a damn pipe bomb at us last night. Richard grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from a nearby toolbox. His ego, already fractured by the loss of his house, could not handle being bested by the stepdaughter he had discarded. Davies, deputize me. Right now. We are going up there. We are dragging her out by her hair, and we are taking that water source. Mayor Higgins looked nervous. Now hold on. If she actually has a safe extraction route for the choppers. Shut up, Higgins, Davies snapped, racking his service shotgun. We maintain order here. Not some delinquent kid. Bo, you lead the way. Richard, you're with me. We're going hunting. They severely underestimated the hostile geography of the Sierra foothills, and they entirely underestimated the 17-year-old girl who had conquered it. The ascent into Black Bear Hollow took them 4 grueling, agonizing hours. By the time Sheriff Davies, Richard Gallagher, Billy Bo Jenkins, and a reluctant 22-year-old Deputy Colin Miller breached the upper tree line, the mountain had already begun to break them. The temperature hovered just above freezing, but the men were drenched in sweat, their heavy boots caked in layers of thick, cement-like mud that added 10 pounds to every step. This is insane, Bo wheezed, leaning heavily against the scarred trunk of a dead pine. He was trembling, still profoundly spooked by the flash powder explosion from the night before. He looked down at the sheer, dizzying drop-off they had just navigated. "Davies, we're gonna die out here. The trails are completely wiped out." "She's a ghost, man." "Shut your mouth and keep climbing," Richard snarled, though his chest heaved violently with every breath. His face was scratched and bleeding from whipping branches, his expensive, waterproof jacket torn at the shoulder. Blinding, toxic pride pushed him forward. He could not return to the refugee camp empty-handed, and he absolutely could not let his discarded stepdaughter hold the entire town hostage. "She's just a brat. She's bluffing about the water." "She ain't bluffing about the terrain," Deputy Miller muttered, adjusting the heavy strap of his radio. Miller was a local kid, barely out of the academy, and the sickening reality of what they were doing was settling heavily into his gut. They weren't a rescue party, they were a hit squad. High above them, perched silently on a granite outcropping shrouded by heavy, weeping cedar boughs, Sadie watched the miserable procession through her scavenged binoculars. She had tracked their clumsy progress for the last 2 miles. They sounded like a herd of panicked cattle thrashing through the brush. She knew they were coming, and she had spent the grueling hours since dawn preparing a welcome. Sadie let out a sharp, piercing whistle. It wasn't a human sound. She mimicked the shrill, echoing cry of a red-tailed hawk, but dragged the note out just long enough to sound unnatural. Down in the ravine, the 4 men froze. Davies immediately racked his service shotgun, the metallic clack deadened by the dense fog rolling in off the canopy. "Gallagher!" Sadie's voice suddenly boomed, bouncing off the rocky walls of the canyon. The acoustics made it impossible to pinpoint her exact location. The voice seemed to come from the sky itself. "You're trespassing on my mountain. Turn back to the valley." "Get down here, you little parasite!" Richard roared, his eyes wide and manic as he spun around in the mud, searching the cliffs. "I'm the victim here. I'm going to drag you back down by your hair and lock you in a cell until you rot." "That's enough, Richard," Davies hissed, his tactical training briefly overriding his anger. "She has the high ground. We move slow." But Richard was past reason. Through the fog, he spotted a glimpse of Sadie's bright blue winter parka slipping behind a massive boulder, 50 yards up the steep embankment. Blinded by rage, he pushed violently past the sheriff, shoving Bo aside. "I see her! I'm gonna kill her!" Richard bellowed, charging blindly up the narrow, muddy path. "Richard! Wait! Stop!" Deputy Miller screamed, pointing frantically at the ground. "The soil is shifting! Look at the water!" But Richard ignored the strange, deliberate piles of stacked river stones Sadie had placed along the edges of the path. He ignored the fact that this specific patch of ground was completely devoid of pine needles or dead leaves. Sadie had not just dug a hole, she had engineered a nightmare. Using a broken entrenching tool she had found weeks ago, she had spent the morning redirecting a highly pressurized, subterranean runoff spring. She channeled gallons of freezing water directly beneath a seemingly solid shelf of clay on the only accessible path. The ground beneath the crust had been turned into a suspended pool of liquefied mud, a freezing quicksand trap. Richard took one heavy, stomping step onto the center of the shelf. The earth didn't just break, it completely dissolved beneath his weight. With a panicked, breathless shout, Richard plummeted downward. The thick, freezing slurry instantly swallowed his legs, then his waist, arresting his fall with a violent jerk. "Help!" Richard screamed, thrashing his arms wildly. The movement was a fatal mistake. The vacuum created by the dense, wet clay reacted to his thrashing by pulling him deeper. Within seconds, the mud was packed tightly against his lower rib cage, compressing his lungs. "Jesus Christ!" Bo screamed, stumbling backward. The sight of the massive man being swallowed by the mountain finally broke Bo's fragile nerve. He dropped his flashlight, turned, and sprinted back down the treacherous trail they had just climbed, abandoning them entirely. Davies and Miller scrambled to the edge of the pit, but the ground around it was entirely unstable. Every time Davies tried to reach out his hand, the lip of the pit crumbled away, sending more freezing water pouring into the trap. "Throw him a branch," Davies yelled, panic finally bleeding into his hardened voice. "There aren't any," Miller yelled back, frantically searching the barren rock face. "We need a rope." The mud was sapping the core temperature from Richard's body at a terrifying rate. His lips were already tinged blue, his breaths coming in short, rapid gasps as the clay squeezed his chest. The absolute, dominating terror in his eyes was something Sadie had never seen before. The tyrant of Elm Avenue was weeping like a terrified child. A small pebble bounced sharply off the barrel of Sheriff Davies' shotgun. The sheriff spun around, raising the weapon. Sadie stepped out from behind the boulder, a mere 15 feet above them. She looked down at the chaotic scene, her face a mask of absolute, chilling calm. In her gloved hands, she held a thick, heavy-duty coiled logging rope with a braided loop at the end. "You want the rope, Davies?" Sadie asked, her voice cutting clearly through the fog. "Throw the damn rope, Sadie. He's freezing to death," Davies barked, aiming the shotgun squarely at her center mass. "I will shoot you right where you stand." Sadie didn't flinch. She stared down the barrel of the gun with the cold detachment of someone who had already faced death a dozen times over the winter. "Shoot me, Davies. Go ahead. The gunshot will trigger the unstable snowpack on the ridge above us, and you'll all be buried under 20 feet of ice. And even if it doesn't, you'll never find your way out of Black Bear Hollow without me guiding you. You'll freeze out here tonight." Davies' finger trembled on the trigger. He looked at the jagged, unfamiliar terrain, then down at the dying man in the mud. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered the weapon. He knew he was utterly outmatched. Sadie shifted her gaze to the young deputy. "Miller, is your body camera charged?" Deputy Miller swallowed hard, his eyes darting between his corrupt boss and the teenage girl holding their lives in her hands. Slowly, he reached up to his chest rig and clicked a button. A small red light blinked to life. "It's rolling. Sadie?" "Good," Sadie said, looking down at the pathetic, gasping man trapped in the earth. "The deal hasn't changed, Richard. A full confession, right now, or I walk away, and you become a permanent part of this mountain." I, Richard stuttered, his teeth clattering so violently he could barely form words. The mud was up to his collarbone now. "Please." "Say it," Sadie commanded, her voice echoing with years of repressed fury. "Say what you did." "I took it," Richard wailed, his head thrown back in absolute defeat, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "I took the mortgage money. I gambled it away in Reno on the playoffs. I lost everything. And what did you tell my mother?" Sadie pressed, stepping closer to the edge, holding the rope aloft. "I blamed you," he sobbed, the words tearing out of his throat in a pathetic, humiliating shriek. "I told Caroline you stole it from the lockbox. I threw you out, so she wouldn't leave me. It was me. It was all me. Please, God, Sadie, throw the rope." The confession hung in the freezing air, immortalized digitally on the deputy's camera. Sadie looked at the broken man. The boiling anger that had kept her alive through the darkest, coldest nights of winter suddenly evaporated. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a sad, weak, desperate coward. With a swift, practiced motion, Sadie hurled the coiled rope. It unspooled perfectly through the air, the heavy, braided loop splashing into the mud inches from Richard's hands. As Miller and Davies grabbed the other end and began the agonizing task of hauling the suctioned man out of the clay, a new vibration began to rattle the loose stones on the ridge. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping, then built into a deafening, chest-rattling roar. The fog above them violently swirled and parted as two massive Chinook military helicopters broke through the cloud cover, their searchlights cutting through the gloom. The National Guard had finally pinpointed her green smoke signal on the adjacent ridge. The authorities from Oakhaven were officially obsolete. The real rescue had arrived. Sadie didn't wait around for the thanks she knew wouldn't come. She turned her back on the shivering, defeated men, pulled her hood up against the freezing rotor wash, and slipped silently back into the dense, dark timber, a ghost returning to her hollow wooden castle. The great washout of Oakhaven became a textbook case of municipal negligence. But the legend of the girl in the hollow Sequoia became local mythology. Richard Gallagher was arrested shortly after the National Guard arrived, his recorded confession to Sheriff Davies' deputies sealing his fate for felony fraud and child endangerment. Caroline eventually left him, moving quietly to Oregon, though Sadie never spoke to her again. Legally emancipated at 17 by a sympathetic federal judge, Sadie refused to return to the valley below. Instead, her profound survival skills and deep knowledge of the old-growth terrain earned her a full scholarship for environmental science, funded entirely by a wealthy conservationist who heard her incredible story. Today, she works as a lead botanist for the Sierra Nevada Reserve. The ancient Sequoia still stands in Black Bear Hollow, its hidden plywood door long removed, returning to the wild. But deep inside the burnt heartwood, a tiny soot stain remains a permanent testament to the girl who outlived the storm.